Chapter 4: The Military Crisis. For as long as most readers will remember, the United States has maintained a considerable military advantage over any potential rivals on the planet. This is no longer the case. As a former career officer in the U.S. Air Force, it hurts to write those words. But the U.S. military needs a reality check, and has needed one for the past 2 decades. We achieved military dominance largely as a result of President Ronald Reagan's peace through strength policies, spending more money on weapons, equipment, and armed forces than any other nation. While spending levels have continued to remain relatively high, our political and military leaders have been slow to realize that China has been fighting a strategic war for decades. This lack of understanding has resulted in ceding gains, strategic, geographical, technological, and digital, to the People's Liberation Army. Take this together, factor in our abandonments of military research and development expenditures, and all of our costly deployments around the globe starting in the 1990s. And you've just written the equation for the erosion of U.S. military superiority. When it comes to deployment, the U.S. military aspires to be nimble and reactive. In many ways, we are still the best in the world at moving military forces and reacting to global emergencies. But it entrenches business as usual priorities of the military-industrial complex, with its focus on short-term hardware procurement and raw military might at expenses of R&D, long-term planning, and rethinking the defense industrial base, have hindered our ability to adjust, to recalibrate, and strategize accordingly. Senior leaders at the Pentagon need to recognize that a modern battlefield includes ones and zeros and dollars and cents. Where is our equivalent cyber force to protect America's data? Where is our Office for Economic Warfare or for counter-propaganda? In no way do I mean to denigrate our armed forces. I seek to improve them. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, America has assumed a role as the world's policeman, and our forces has ensured stability, ended wars, and promoted peace in Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. We have also entered 2 decades-long military engagement in Afghanistan and Iraq. These wars have proven extremely costly, and we have shouldered far more than our share of the expense. It is an unassailable fact that many of our NATO allies have not adhered to agreed-upon contributions. The wars take up personnel, equipment, and billions of dollars, bog down our military, and prevent the Pentagon from making needed investment in R&D, social cyber warfare, and the type of weapon systems that China cannot defend against. And while our military has been taking fire, battling the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS, the Chinese have been busy waging their quiet, non-combat war, assembling an enormous cyber division, obtaining sophisticated weapons technology, constructing ports, islands, and military bases, installing telecom technology, a key tool for spycraft, and using American investment to build its defense systems. Reality check. The United States cannot fight a ground war without China. Well, we could, for a little while, but the amount of goods and materials that have shipped and continue to ship from China for military use is mind-boggling. Yes, there are laws mandating that the U.S. military buy goods that are made in America, but a daunting amount of military equipment contains components made in China. the propellant that fires our Hellfire missiles, which are launched from helicopters, jets, and drones, is imported from China. The glass in night vision goggles contains a metal called lanthanum, the vast majority of which comes from China. Our officers write down plans and reports and print them out on computers, which come predominantly from China. Instructional videos are watched on screens made in China. The handheld video game players that entertain off-duty troops, largely made in China. The list that goes on and on is absurd. If supply lines were cut from China, if a trade war broke out with embargoes, the U.S. military would have a nightmare sourcing its needs and getting them to the battleground, wherever that might be. Ironically, the way we would communicate about these shortages also relies on China. We don't manufacture any mobile phones in this country. The Army uses phones, lots of them. Our almost complete dependence on China and other countries for telecommunications equipment present potentially catastrophic battlefield vulnerabilities, wrote Brigadier General John Adams, U.S. Army, retired, in a 2015 essay. This is a daunting concept. We've outsourced ourselves to a point where we can't defend ourselves and our interests without Chinese manufacturing and logistical support. Fortunately, at the moment, China has no interest in engaging in a ground war or any kind of war that entails actual violence and physical destruction. It does, however, have an interest in supplying goods for wars. The CCP would rather boost its coffers serving our troops and use that revenue to bolster its strategic positions, build its Belt and Road infrastructure plan, which will eventually create a global footprint and supply chain for its own army, should a need arise, and invest in high-tech weapons to fuel that army. Indeed, using Western capital, never mind Western technology, to build its military is part of the CCP's strategy. Between January 2004 and January 2015, Gable Collins reported in The Diplomat, the publicly listed arms of China Shipbuilding Industry Corporation, CSIC Limited, and that of China State Shipbuilding Corporation, CSSC Holdings, raised a combined total of $22.26 billion from selling stock and bonds. Every dollar raised on the market and plowed into upgraded yacht infrastructure, staff, and warship equipment frees up military budget funds for other uses. Collins astutely noted, it's worth adding that the Chinese Navy has outstripped our American fleet in sheer numbers. As of 2017, China's Navy had 370 ships. The U.S. Navy had 287. We will return to discussing the rival naval forces in a moment. But first, let's examine one effort to fund a tangential part of the China war machine that backfired. It shows both how China tries to lure foreign investment against the West's interests and how compliance to international standards of fair trade can stop Chinese manipulation in its tracks. On July 2, 2015, the Stock Exchange of Hong Kong published documents revealing that China Communication Construction Company, CCCC, the largest port dredging company in the world, had filed plans to spin off a subsidiary, CCCC Dredging, in an IPO targeted to raise from $800 million to $1 billion. Numerous reports have named CCCC as the company that built the controversial man-made islands in the Spalding archipelago in the South China Sea. These islands are viewed by many in the international community as illegal constructions, built for the purpose of housing aggressive military installations and furthering China's dubious claim to policing international waters. One of the islands, Fiery Cross Reef, home to a 3-kilometer runway and missile and radar installations, was built by CCCC at an estimated cost of $11 billion. CCCC's role in the creation of the islands and military installations was a huge red flag for some market watchers. One of them was Roger Robinson. His global risk consulting firm, RWR Advisory Group, obtained the prospectus for the IPO. Nowhere in the document did CCCC mention its island building in the South China Sea. Since CCCC reportedly built islands, and in light of the international censor, the company faced a strong possibility of legal exposure. Furthermore, the South China Sea and East China Sea Sanctions Act, introduced by Florida Senator Marco Rubio in 2017, and still under consideration, would target any Chinese person that contributes to construction or development projects in areas of South China Sea contested by one or more members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, and would render CCCC as a potential sanctionable entity because of its role. Robinson's team contacted the Hong Kong Exchange and asked whether the CCCC admitted to island building in any documents. The answer was no. We basically made a point that there is a material risk that a company could be sanctioned, and that clearly represented a material risk to prospective shareholders, Robinson explained. The stock exchange representatives went back to CCCC, dredging and directed it to update its prospectus. The company refused, insisting there was nothing controversial. They said, "We're not going to dignify this notion that this territory is disputed. This is our sovereign territory. It's no different than Exxon drilling off New Jersey," said Robinson. They actually used that argument. Robinson's team then warned the Hong Kong Exchange that it was exposing itself to legal action if it sponsored the IPO, because it had prior knowledge of risk. A class action suit against the exchange would be sure to follow. Finally, the Hong Kong Exchange went back to CCCC and said, "No, we have to insist," and said Robinson. And CCCC dredging pulled IPO and walked away. That's $1 billion in foregone money. The IPO is, to my knowledge, the only price that China has ever paid for its illegal island building in the South China Sea after all this time. Circumdefenses. Let's return to the issue of naval superiority. The big selling point for analysts who insist that the U.S. Navy has bigger, better ships than China is the fact that U.S. aircraft carriers outnumber, outperform, and dwarf China's. Given that differential, it's easy to see how people might assume this gives the United States a huge advantage. That assumption, however, would be wrong. China's geographical location and its missile capacity provide it with a very comfortable defensive cocoon. The two countries are thousands of miles apart, and while the United States has military installations in Japan and South Korea, and the daunting flexibility of those aircraft carriers, China has created defenses that nullify the power of those forces. China has thousands of precision warheads tied to a sophisticated command and control system. Its Dongfeng 26 ballistic missile, 46 feet long, 44,000 pounds, and built to carry both nuclear and conventional warheads, was designed to obliterate aircraft carriers. The Dongfeng 26 has a range of 2,500 miles, which means it can strike U.S. warships in the Western Pacific Ocean, including ships based in Japan. So do the missiles. In order to deploy a carrier's bomber on a mission in the South China Sea, the carrier would have to come within range of Dongfeng 26 and other missiles that would destroy it. And while the U.S. Navy has SM-6 interceptor missiles thought to be capable of destroying a Dongfeng 26, the sheer amount of smaller long-range ballistic missiles at China's disposal and the blazing speed with which these weapons travel, 6,000 miles in 30 minutes, pose, at the moment, an enormous threat to our ships. It is conceivable that an undetected conflict might end in 30 seconds. Game over. Look at from an economic standpoint. The PLA constructed a $1 billion missile system designed to destroy a $30 billion ship. There is no doubt our carriers are valuable and powerful machines, but their effectiveness in policing the Pacific is now extremely limited. While China has made great strides in missile deployment, U.S. armed forces have been unable to match production because of the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union. This pact not only called for both parties to stop building nuclear and conventional ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles with range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers. It also called for the elimination of these weapons. By 1991, 2,692 weapons had been destroyed. In other words, after the United States began emptying its silos in the hopes of reducing danger and destruction, China, which was not part of the treaty, began acquiring the technology to build and then stockpile an enormous arsenal. Meanwhile, the Russian government eventually stopped adhering to the treaty. In February of 2019, after repeatedly warning Russia about illegal missile deployments near Ukraine, the United States announced that it was ending the treaty, effectively setting a path toward answering China's missile threat. Lest anyone think I'm picking on the Navy, my own department, the Air Force, had slipped too. Our most impressive fighting machine, the F-35, has also been stripped of its power by Chinese technology, and I will explain why soon. China had also built a very sophisticated command and control network, known as the C4ISR, Command, Control, Communications, Computers, Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance in the Pacific. This network uses technology computers to SYNC the military operational decision-making, command and control, with the ability to synthesize and analyze the military information, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, quickly and initiate communications, offensive and defensive actions. Think of C4ISR as the most sophisticated alarm and response system on the planet, one that creates operational and strategic advantages by using land-based radar, remote sensors, manned and unmanned military platforms, and intelligence data to optimize outcomes on the battlefield. The U.S. Armed Forces do not have a fully operational C4ISR equivalent in the Pacific, but we need one because right now our command and control capacities there rely heavily on satellites. If the satellites were attacked and disabled, our ability to use some of our most deadly instruments of deterrence would be critically impacted. So now, more than ever, we need to have a totally secure second network to ensure that our systems are safe and running at maximal efficiency. The foundation of that second network is something called 5G. Don't forget that term. Our nation's security depends on it. Remember those aircraft carriers we were talking about. They are powered by nuclear reactors. Once I became aware of China's strategy, I began to think differently about the policies that the Department of Defense should be concerned about. Friendly fire. In the winter of 2015, while I was working for the Joint Chief of Staff, I received an email notifying me that the United States was going to sign a renewal of something called a 123 agreement with China. I had never heard of this type of agreement, so I made some inquiries and got a hold of the proposal. The 123 agreements are named after Section 123 of the Atomic Energy Act of 1954, which is basically an agreement of cooperation in order to share peaceful nuclear technology with foreign countries. So far, we have these agreements in place with more than 40 countries. I thought about the ramifications of this for about 5 seconds and reached a clear and present conclusion. Signing the proposed 123 agreement with China was a terrible idea. There were many reasons for this determination. The proposed agreement would allow China to buy the Westinghouse AP1000 nuclear power plant. Yes, the reactors in these power plants are built and sold to generate safe energy, which many nations need. I instantly realized that the Chinese would now have reactors and would quickly reverse engineer the process so they could figure out how to build their own reactors, since no technology, once deployed in China, is safe from being pirated. But allowing China to steal and manufacture power plants, well, anti-competitive, illegal, and corrupt, wasn't my biggest concern, not even close. Selling this technology to China meant that the know-how that went into their development would aid the PLA in improving their own naval nuclear reactors. By agreeing to this deal, we would be sharing engineering expertise that could be used against us in a hostile manner, with a nation that has openly declared its hostility. There was no way we could let this happen. It was as if we would be giving away national security secrets. I sent a message back. The Joint Staff absolutely does not agree with renewing this deal. When asked to discuss our objections, I laid them out, explaining that building a reactor in China was tantamount to just handling them plans. I explained how Chinese firms have stolen or lifted American intellectual property for decades, and that Westinghouse proprietary nuclear technology would almost certainly be transferred to the People's Liberation Army to develop nuclear-powered equipment that would rival our ships and planes. I also stressed that one of the reasons America's submarines are so quiet and therefore harder to detect is that the nuclear technology we used was vastly superior to what the PLA currently had. None of this seemed to matter. In fact, some of the representatives from the State Department and the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which are responsible for the 123 agreement, looked at me like I was crazy. In the end, The Joint Chief recommendations were ignored. The powers that had been in the Obama administration overruled us. I have no idea who made the final decision or what their reasoning was. It is possible lobbyists applied pressure to influential members of Obama's cabinet. Or perhaps someone just thought that trade and revenue generation were more important than national security. If that was what happened, then it is another textbook case of America ignoring long-term potential damage in favor of short-term gains. That business before reality kind of thinking is our nation's own worst enemy and plays directly into our rivals' hands. But I saw it in action with even more dangerous results when I joined the National Security Council and began to plan for a game with much higher stakes.